If you've ever woken up in the middle of the night and had the strange feeling that something in your house had changed while you were asleep, you'll understand why what happened to me still bothers me years later. I didn't grow up believing in anything supernatural. I was raised in a quiet town outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, in a neighborhood where nothing unusual ever really happened. My parents were practical people. My father worked maintenance at a hospital. My mother was a receptionist at a dental office. And the closest thing we ever had to drama was when a neighbor's dog kept knocking over our trash cans at night. So when I say I don't scare easily, I mean it. But the summer I turned 23, I took a job that changed the way I think about silence and about children. It started with an ad I almost didn't respond to. At the time, I'd just graduated from a small community college and was stuck in one of those situations where you're technically an adult but still living like a teenager. I was back in my childhood bedroom, sleeping under the same faded ceiling fan I'd had since I was 12, spending most days sending out resumes and most nights scrolling job sites with a kind of quiet panic sitting in my chest. The listing was simple. Night supervisor needed, private youth residence, room provided, competitive pay, immediate start. No company name, no detailed description, just a phone number and an address about 40 minutes outside the city. I called mostly out of boredom. A man answered on the second ring. His voice was calm and measured, with the kind of politeness that felt practiced rather than natural. He introduced himself as Daniel Harlow and explained that the residence housed at-risk minors placed there temporarily by courts or social services. They needed someone dependable for overnight supervision, mostly observation, making rounds, reporting anything unusual. It sounded easy enough. The interview was scheduled the next morning. The place was called West Ridge House. I didn't see the sign until I was already turning into the long gravel drive that led to it. The building itself sat back from the road behind a line of tall pines, and the first thing I noticed was how quiet everything felt. Not peaceful quiet, just still. The house was bigger than I expected. Not a mansion exactly, but close enough that I immediately wondered how many kids actually lived there. 3 stories, pale siding, narrow windows, and a covered porch that ran along the front. The architecture reminded me of old boarding schools I'd seen in documentaries. Functional, plain, almost intentionally forgettable. I parked near a row of identical white vans and sat in the car for a minute longer than necessary, watching the building. Nothing moved behind the windows. No voices carried outside. No doors opened. It looked closed, even though I knew it wasn't. Inside, the air smelled faintly like disinfectant and something else I couldn't place at the time. The entryway opened into a long hallway with scuffed floors and fluorescent lights that hummed softly overhead. A camera sat in the corner of the ceiling, angled directly toward the door. A woman at the front desk greeted me with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She asked me to wait. A few minutes later, Daniel Harlow appeared. He was taller than I expected, thin without looking unhealthy, with gray hair cut short and neat around the ears. He wore a navy button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms and carried a clipboard tucked against his side like he'd been holding it all morning. "Thanks for coming," he said, shaking my hand. His grip was firm, but not warm. We talked in a small office off the hallway. He explained the job carefully, almost methodically. My shift would run from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. I'd be responsible for hourly rounds of all sleeping areas, documenting any disturbances, checking doors and windows, and making sure the security monitors stayed active. "The residents sleep well most nights," he told me. "You won't have much trouble." I asked how many kids were there. 27 currently, he said, ages 9 through 17. That number stuck with me. 27 felt like a lot for a place that quiet. He offered me the job before the interview ended. I started the following Monday. My first night was uneventful in a way that almost felt staged. The evening staff walked me through everything: the dorm layouts, the staff office, the laundry room, the cafeteria area. The boys slept on the second floor, the girls on the third. Cameras covered the main halls, stairwells, and entrances, but not the sleeping rooms themselves. At 10:25 p.m., the lights were out across the building. By 11, the entire place was silent. At first, I appreciated that. I brought a notebook and spent the first couple of hours learning the routine, walking slow laps through the hallways and checking doors the way they'd shown me. But around midnight, I started noticing small things. Nothing obvious, nothing dramatic, just small details that didn't quite make sense. The first thing was the doors. The kids' sleeping rooms had heavy doors with narrow observation windows set at eye level. During rounds, I'd pause at each one and look through quietly to confirm everyone was in bed. Most rooms looked exactly like you'd expect, but a few felt wrong. I couldn't explain it at the time. It wasn't anything I saw directly. It was more the feeling that I was interrupting something by standing there. At 12:40 a.m., I made my second full round. Everything seemed normal until I reached the far end of the second floor hallway. Room 214. I remember the number clearly because it was the first time something actually happened. When I looked through the glass, I saw a boy sitting upright in his bed, staring straight at the door. He didn't blink, didn't move, just sat there watching me like he'd been waiting. I opened the door slowly so it wouldn't creak. "You okay?" I asked quietly. He didn't answer right away. Up close, he looked younger than I expected, maybe 10 or 11, thin, pale, with short dark hair and eyes that seemed too alert for the middle of the night. "I heard something," he said finally. "What kind of something?" He hesitated. Then he shook his head once like he'd changed his mind. "Nothing." I waited a few seconds before telling him to try to sleep. He lay back down, turning toward the wall. I closed the door and stood there longer than I should have, listening. The hallway stayed silent. But as I started walking away, I realized something I hadn't noticed before. Every door along that section of the hallway was slightly open. Not wide, just enough that I could see a thin line of darkness between the frame and the door. I stopped and looked back down the corridor. It felt like the building itself was watching me. I told myself it was nothing, just bad hinges or kids who didn't shut them all the way. But later that night, during my 3 a.m. round, I found every one of those doors closed tight, and I don't remember hearing them shut. That was the first night. The first time I realized something inside West Ridge House didn't follow the same rules as everywhere else. And at the time, I still thought I could explain it. I didn't know then that within 2 weeks, I'd be standing in the same hallway at almost the exact same hour, listening to a sound coming from behind one of those closed doors that I still... By the time I got home the next morning, I'd already convinced myself the first night had been normal. That's the thing about quiet places. If nothing obvious happens, your brain fills in the gaps with logic, whether it makes sense or not. I'd told myself the boy in room 214 had probably just had a bad dream. The doors were old, the hinges were loose. Buildings made noises at night, especially big ones. By the time I went back for my second shift, I almost wasn't thinking about it anymore. Almost. My routine settled in quickly after that. I'd arrive a little before 10,
sign in, get a short update from the evening staff, and then take over once the kids were in their rooms. The night itself broke down into predictable pieces. 10:30 p.m., first full round. Midnight, the quietest hour. 2 a.m., the hardest stretch to stay alert. 4 a.m., the building started to feel different somehow. That last part was the hardest to explain. Most places feel quieter after midnight. West Ridge didn't. It felt heavier. By my fourth night, I started noticing patterns I hadn't picked up on before. For one thing, the kids barely spoke during the day. I'd see them during shift changes sometimes, when they were being moved between activities, and they always seemed unusually quiet for their age. No running, no shouting, no normal chaos you expect when you put 27 kids in one building. They walked in straight lines. They didn't look at staff unless spoken to, and most of them avoided eye contact with me completely. At first, I thought it was because I was new, but even after a week, it didn't change. The second thing I noticed was the staff. There weren't many of them overnight, usually just one other person somewhere in the building. But even during the day shifts, the atmosphere felt controlled in a way I couldn't quite define. Conversations were short, instructions were precise. Nobody lingered anywhere longer than necessary. The only exception was Daniel Harlow. He stayed late most nights, usually in his office at the end of the first-floor hallway. His door stayed closed, but sometimes when I passed, I could hear him talking quietly on the phone. His tone was always calm, controlled. One night, around 11:30, I passed his office and noticed the door slightly open. I didn't mean to listen, but I heard him say one sentence clearly enough that I remember it word for word. Yes, but they're adjusting faster than expected. There was a pause after that. Then he closed the door. I kept walking. I didn't ask about it. By the second week, I'd memorized the building well enough that my rounds felt automatic. I knew which floors creaked, which lights flickered, which vents rattled when the air system kicked on. That's why I noticed immediately when something changed. It was my 9th night. The shift started like every other one. By midnight, the building was completely silent. I finished my 2 first rounds without seeing anything unusual and sat in the staff office for a while, watching the security monitors. The cameras showed long, empty hallways under fluorescent light. Nothing moved. Around 1:15 a.m., I started another round. Everything felt normal until I reached the 3rd floor. The girls' hallway was always quieter than the boys', but that night it felt different. Not louder, not darker, just wrong somehow. I moved slowly down the corridor, checking each room window the way I always did. Most of the girls were asleep, curled under identical gray blankets. Then I reached room 307. I remember pausing before I even looked inside. I don't know why. Something just made me stop. When I finally leaned toward the glass, I saw 3 girls sitting upright in their beds, all of them facing the same direction, toward the far wall. They didn't move when I opened the door. "Everything okay?" I asked quietly. No one answered. I stepped inside. "Girls?" The one closest to me turned slowly. Her expression wasn't scared exactly, just blank. "We heard it." "Heard what?" She didn't respond. The other 2 stayed facing the wall. After a few seconds, I told them to lie back down. They did immediately, without argument, like they'd been waiting for permission. I stayed there another minute before leaving. When I stepped back into the hallway, I realized something else. The air felt colder. Not dramatically colder, just enough that I noticed it through my shirt sleeves. I finished the round faster than usual after that. But when I came back to the monitors, I couldn't stop thinking about what the girl had said. We heard it. I sat there for almost 20 minutes, replaying the moment in my head, trying to figure out what it could be. That's when I heard the first sound myself. It was faint enough at first that I thought it came from outside, a low, uneven noise somewhere in the building. I stood up immediately and listened. It happened again, soft, rhythmic, like something being dragged slowly across a hard surface. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. The building carried sound strangely at night. Sometimes you'd hear pipes knocking 3 floors away, like they were right next to you. But this didn't sound mechanical. It sounded deliberate. I checked the monitors again. Nothing. The hallways were still empty. The sound came again, closer this time. I left the office and stepped into the hallway. For a few seconds, everything was completely silent. Then I heard it again, from upstairs, the 3rd floor. I stood at the base of the stairs longer than I should have before starting up. Each step felt louder than usual under my shoes. Halfway up, I realized something else. The lights at the top of the staircase were off. They were never off. I reached the landing and stopped. The hallway stretched ahead of me in dim shadow, and somewhere down near the far end, I heard the dragging sound again. I didn't move right away. I just stood there listening, trying to figure out if what I was hearing was real or if my brain was playing tricks on me. Then I heard something else, a whisper. Too quiet to understand, but close enough that I knew it hadn't come from any of the rooms. It had come from the hallway. I forced myself to walk slowly forward. The dragging sound stopped as soon as I moved. The silence after it felt worse than the noise itself. When I reached room 307 again, I noticed the door was open. I knew for a fact I'd closed it earlier. I stood in the doorway for a second before stepping inside. All 3 beds were empty. At first, I thought I'd checked the wrong room, but then I noticed the blankets. They were folded neatly at the foot of each bed, like no one had been sleeping there at all. I checked the bathroom. Empty. Closets. Empty. When I stepped back into the hallway, I felt something I hadn't felt since I started working there. Actual fear. Not panic, just a quiet, steady realization that something was very wrong inside that building. And standing there alone in that dark hallway, I understood for the first time that whatever I'd heard earlier, it hadn't been an accident, and it definitely hadn't been mechanical. Because as I stood there listening, trying to decide what to do next, I heard the dragging sound again, directly behind me.
I didn't turn around right away. For a few seconds, I just stood there, frozen in the doorway of room 307, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. The dragging sound stopped almost immediately. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I'd experienced in that building so far. I told myself to move. Slowly, I turned. The hallway behind me was empty. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed faintly, casting that same pale, washed-out glow across the floor and walls. Every door was closed. Nothing moved. For a moment, I almost laughed at myself. Then I noticed the floor. About 10 feet behind me, right in the middle of the hallway, was a faint streak across the polished surface. It looked like something had been pulled along the ground. I walked toward it slowly, my eyes locked on the mark. Up close, it was even stranger. Not a scuff from a shoe, not dirt. It looked like a narrow smear, dull and gray, stretching in a straight line for several feet before fading out completely. I crouched down without thinking and ran my fingers lightly over it. It felt slightly rough and cold. I wiped my hand on my pants and stood up quickly, suddenly aware of how exposed I felt standing there. My first instinct was to check the stairwell. I moved fast now, scanning the hallway as I walked. When I reached the stairs, I leaned over the railing and listened. Nothing. No movement below. I went back to room 307 and checked it again just to be sure I hadn't missed something. Still empty. I stood there trying to decide what to do next. Protocol said I should report any missing residents immediately, but something about the situation made me hesitate. Not because I thought I was in trouble, because I had the sudden, uncomfortable feeling that if I reported it too quickly, I'd be admitting I didn't understand what was happening, and I didn't like that feeling. I left the room and continued down the hallway. That's when I saw them. At the far end, near the emergency exit door, 3 small shapes stood in a row against the wall. I stopped walking. Even from that distance, I knew who they were. The girls from room 307. They were standing shoulder to shoulder, perfectly still, facing the wall. I started toward them slowly. "Hey," I said quietly. None of them reacted. I got closer. "Girls," I said again, louder this time. "What are you doing out here?" Still nothing. I was about 5 feet away when the middle one spoke. "Did you hear it?" Her voice sounded flat. I stepped closer. "What?" She didn't turn around. "The counting," she said. I felt something tighten in my chest. "What counting?" None of them answered. I moved in front of them so I could see their faces. All 3 looked exhausted, pale, eyes wide and unfocused like they hadn't slept in days. "You shouldn't be out here," I told them quietly. "Let's go back to your room." The girl on the left shook her head slowly. "He doesn't like it when we close the door." I stared at her. "Who?" She blinked slowly, like the question confused her. Then she looked past me, over my shoulder, toward the hallway behind me, and for the first time since I'd walked up to them, her expression changed. Not fear exactly, recognition. I turned around instinctively. The hallway was still empty. When I looked back at the girls, all 3 of them had turned their heads toward the stairwell at the same time, listening. A second later, I heard it too. The dragging sound again, only this time it was coming from downstairs. The girls didn't move while I stood there deciding what to do. Finally, I told them quietly to go back to their room. To my surprise, they obeyed immediately. I watched them walk the entire way back down the hallway, enter room 307, and climb into their beds without speaking. I closed the door firmly behind them. Then I stood there for a long time listening. The dragging sound didn't come back after that. I finished my rounds quickly and stayed in the staff office for the rest of the night with the monitors on, watching every hallway camera more carefully than I ever had before. Nothing else happened. But the next morning, I reported everything to Daniel Harlow. I told him about the girls leaving their room, the hallway smear, the noise, everything. He listened without interrupting, his expression calm and unreadable. When I finished, he nodded once. "I'll speak with them," he said. "That's it?" I asked before I could stop myself. He looked at me for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. Night buildings can feel different, especially large ones. Sound travels in unusual ways. Children sometimes wander when they're unsettled. I didn't argue with him, but I knew that wasn't the full explanation. Before I left his office, he added something else. "Don't overthink it," he said quietly. That was all. But as I walked back down the hallway afterwards, I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. Right outside his office door, near the baseboard along the wall, was another faint gray streak across the floor, and this one led directly toward the stairwell. That night when I came back from my shift, I noticed something else had changed. Room 307 was empty. The beds were stripped, the mattresses gone, and the door had been locked from the outside. No one mentioned it. And when I asked one of the evening staff where the girls had gone, she just said quietly, "They were transferred." Then she walked away before I could ask anything else. That was the moment I realized something I should have understood earlier.
At West Ridge House, questions didn't get answered. They just disappeared. And by then, I'd already started noticing things I couldn't ignore anymore. Like some nights, when I walked past the third-floor hallway after midnight, I could hear faint whispering coming from behind doors that I knew were empty. Can't explain.
After room 307 was cleared out, the third floor felt different. Not quieter, just hollow. For the next few nights, I caught myself slowing down every time I reached that hallway, like part of me expected to see the girls standing there again, against the wall where I'd found them. But the hall stayed empty. The locked door didn't help. Room 307 had a heavy metal handle and a small observation window like the others, but now a square steel plate covered the glass from the inside. I noticed it the second night after they were gone. No one had told me they'd done that. The cameras showed nothing unusual those nights, but I still found myself checking the third floor more often than I needed to. I told myself I was just being thorough, but the truth was, I didn't trust the silence anymore. About a week after the girls were transferred, something else happened that I still think about more than anything else from that job. It started with the monitors. I just finished my midnight round and was sitting in the staff office going through the cameras like I always did. Most of the screens showed the usual empty corridors under fluorescent light. Then I noticed one of the third floor feeds looked darker than the others. Not off, just dimmer somehow. I leaned closer to the screen. The camera angle was pointed straight down the far end of the hallway near room 307. The picture looked normal, except for one thing. The emergency exit door at the end of the corridor was slightly open. I knew that door had been locked earlier. I checked it myself during rounds. At first, I thought the camera image was delayed or glitching. I switched between screens twice to make sure I wasn't looking at the wrong feed. But when I looked again, the door was still open. I stood up immediately and headed for the stairs. Halfway up, I felt the same strange tension I'd started noticing more often lately, that sense that something had already happened before I got there. When I reached the third floor, I stopped at the landing and listened. Nothing. I walked slowly down the hallway toward the exit door. The air felt colder again. Not dramatically colder, just enough that I noticed the difference. When I got closer, I realized the door wasn't wide open, just cracked, maybe 2 inches. I stood there for a second, staring at it. Then I pushed it open slowly. The outside air hit me immediately, cold and damp and quiet. The narrow concrete landing beyond the door was empty. I stepped outside and looked around. West Ridge sat surrounded by woods, and at night there wasn't much to see beyond the tree line. The parking lot lights didn't reach that far. But something about standing out there made me uneasy in a way I couldn't explain. I went back inside and locked the door carefully behind me. That's when I noticed the floor again. Another faint gray streak. This one started just inside the doorway and stretched down the hallway toward the stairwell. I followed it slowly. It faded after about 10 feet like the others had. I didn't crouch down this time. I just stood there staring at it longer than I should have. Later that night, around 2:30 a.m., I heard the dragging sound again. This time I knew exactly what it was the second I heard it. I left the office immediately and moved toward the stairs without even checking the monitors. The sound stopped halfway up the staircase. I kept going anyway. When I reached the third floor, everything was silent again. I checked every door along the hallway. All closed, all quiet. But when I passed room 307, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The steel plate covering the observation window had been scratched. Not deeply,
just shallow marks near the edges, like someone had run their fingernails across it repeatedly. I stood there staring at it for a long time. Eventually, I reached out and touched the metal. It felt cold enough that I pulled my hand away immediately. The next morning, I asked Daniel Harlow about it. I tried to keep my voice neutral when I described the scratch marks and the open door and the sounds I'd been hearing. He listened the same way he always did, calm, focused. Then he said something that stuck with me. "You're paying closer attention now," he told me. "That's good." I waited for him to say more. He didn't. When I asked directly if there had been complaints about noises before I started working there, he paused for a moment before answering. "Older buildings settle," he said finally. I didn't push him after that. But over the next few nights, the pattern started getting harder to ignore. The dragging sound didn't happen every night, but when it did, it always came between 2 and 3 a.m., always from the third floor. And every time I heard it, I found another faint gray streak afterwards somewhere in the hallway. I started keeping notes in my pocket notebook, dates, times, locations, trying to find some kind of logic in it. But the entries didn't make sense. Some nights nothing happened at all. Other nights the sound came twice. Once I heard it directly above me while I was sitting in the staff office on the first floor. The worst part was how quickly I got used to it. After a while, the sound didn't scare me the way it had at first. It just made me tense, like waiting for something you know is coming but can't stop. About 3 weeks after the girls were transferred, something else happened that I still think about more than anything else from that job. It started with the kids. Not all of them, just a few, mostly the younger ones. They looked more tired than usual during shift changes, quieter than before. And once, during dinner cleanup, I overheard 2 boys whispering to each other near the cafeteria door. One of them said something I didn't understand at first. He stopped counting last night. The other one told him to shut up immediately. They both looked up at me at the same time. Neither of them said another word after that. That night, during my 2 a.m. round, I realized something else I hadn't noticed before. The third-floor hallway smelled different. Not strong, just faint enough that I couldn't tell what it was at first. But the longer I stood there, the more familiar it seemed. Then I realized what it reminded me of. Old concrete after rain, damp and stale, like somewhere that stayed wet too long. I stood there in that hallway longer than I should have again, listening and trying to decide if I was imagining things. And while I stood there, I heard something I hadn't heard before. Not dragging, not whispering, just a soft sound coming from behind the locked door of room 307. At first, I thought it was air moving through the vents. But then I heard it again, a slow, uneven tapping from the inside.
I stood outside room 307 for longer than I want to admit. At first, I told myself I wasn't really hearing anything. Buildings made noise, pipes expanded, air vents rattled. I'd already learned that much working nights there. But the tapping came again, slow, uneven. 3 soft knocks, then silence. I moved closer to the door without thinking. The hallway felt colder than usual again. I could feel it through my sleeves. I pressed my ear lightly against the wood. For a few seconds there was nothing. Then I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. Not rhythmic, not steady, almost hesitant. I pulled back slowly and stared at the door. I knew the room was empty. I checked it earlier that night myself. The beds were gone, the windows sealed, the door locked from the outside. There was no reason for anyone to be in there. Still, I found myself reaching for the handle before I even realized I was doing it. It didn't move. Locked. The tapping stopped while I stood there holding the handle. I stayed like that for another few seconds before letting go and stepping back. I told myself I should get a staff member, but I didn't. Instead, I stood there trying to convince myself the sound had been something simple. That's when I noticed the metal plate again. The scratches across it looked worse than they had before. Not deeper exactly, just more of them. Thin, overlapping marks across the surface, like someone had dragged something sharp across it over and over. I reached out and touched the metal again without thinking. It felt colder than anything else in the building. I pulled my hand away quickly and stepped back. That's when the tapping started again, louder this time. Not by much, but enough that I felt it through the door. I stood there frozen for a second before turning and walking quickly down the hallway toward the stairs. I didn't run, but I didn't stop walking until I reached the staff office. I sat in front of the monitors for the rest of the hour without moving much, replaying the sound in my head over and over again. At 3 a.m., I forced myself to do another round. Room 307 was quiet when I passed it. No tapping, no sound at all. But as I walked by, I noticed something else. Another faint gray smear across the floor. This one started directly under the door. The next morning, I reported everything again. This time, Daniel Harlow didn't brush it off immediately. He asked more questions than usual. Exact time, exact sound, how long it lasted, where I was standing, whether I'd touched the door. His tone stayed calm the whole time, but I noticed he wrote everything down. When I finished, he sat quietly for a moment. Then he said something I didn't expect. "You shouldn't go near that room anymore during your rounds." I stared at him. "Why?" He hesitated before answering. "Just focus on the occupied areas," he said finally. That answer didn't make me feel better. If anything, it made things worse. That night, I tried to follow his instructions. I really did. I stayed on the opposite side of the hallway during my rounds and avoided looking at the door more than necessary. But around 2:20 a.m., I heard something else that made that impossible. It started faintly again, not tapping this time, breathing, soft, uneven. I stopped walking immediately and listened. It was coming from behind the door. I stood there frozen, listening to it for several seconds before I realized something else. There were two different breaths, one shallow and fast, the other slow and deep. I don't know how long I stood there listening before I finally forced myself to move again. When I reached the end of the hallway and turned back for one last look, the corridor was completely still. But the next night was worse, much worse. It started normally enough, nothing unusual during the first few hours. But at exactly 2:47 a.m., the dragging sound started again, louder than I'd ever heard it before. It lasted longer, too. I left the office immediately and moved toward the stairs. The sound didn't stop this time. It continued as I climbed, slow, heavy, like something being pulled steadily across the floor. By the time I reached the third floor, my hands were shaking. The hallway was empty again, but the sound continued, coming from somewhere near the far end. I walked slowly toward it, my eyes moving constantly between the doors and the floor. The sound stopped the second I reached room 307. The silence afterward felt unreal. I stood there for several seconds before noticing the door again. It wasn't closed all the way anymore, just slightly open. I stared at it long enough before moving closer. I knew I hadn't opened it earlier. I knew it had been locked. Still, I reached out slowly and pushed it open. The room was dark, completely empty. At least, that's what I thought at first. Then I heard the sound again, behind me, in the hallway. I turned around immediately. The corridor was empty, but when I looked down, I saw a fresh gray smear across the floor just a few feet from where I stood, still wet,
still moving slightly at the edges, like it had just been made. I didn't wait to figure out what it was. I backed into the room slowly and closed the door behind me without taking my eyes off the hallway. That's when I noticed something else. The inside wall opposite the door had marks on it too, long vertical streaks running down toward the floor. I stepped closer without thinking, and that's when I realized they weren't just streaks. They were numbers, scratched into the paint over and over again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Dozens of them, layered on top of each other, like someone had been counting for a very long time. And while I stood there staring at them, I heard the dragging sound again, this time directly outside the door. I didn't breathe. For a few seconds, I just stood there inside room 307, staring at the door while the dragging sound moved slowly across the hallway outside. It passed directly in front of the door, then stopped. The silence afterward felt louder than anything I'd heard all night. I backed away from the door slowly until I felt the wall behind me. That's when I noticed something else about the numbers scratched into the paint. They weren't random. They were grouped. Clusters of marks layered over each other in uneven rows. Some were deeper than others, carved hard enough to expose the plaster underneath. And in between the clusters were gaps, like pauses, like whoever had made them had stopped and started again, over and over. I stood there staring at them longer than I should have, trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense. Then I heard the handle move, very slowly. I froze. The handle didn't turn all the way, just enough that I saw it shift slightly under the hallway light coming through the crack around the frame. I didn't move. After a few seconds, the handle stopped moving. Then the dragging sound started again, fading slowly down the hallway. I stayed inside the room for several minutes after that, long enough for my breathing to slow down, long enough for the building to feel quiet again. When I finally opened the door and stepped back into the hallway, it was empty. But there was another smear on the floor now, wider than the others, and this one curved slightly as it faded away, like whatever had made it had changed direction at the last second. I finished the rest of my rounds faster than usual that night and stayed in the office with the monitors till morning. I didn't report everything right away the next day. I told myself I needed to think first, but by the following shift, I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. That afternoon, before work, I went back through my notebook and read everything I'd written since I started. The sounds, the streaks, the nights they happened, the things the kids had said. One detail kept standing out more than the others: the counting. That night, during my shift, I paid closer attention than ever before. I checked the third floor more often than necessary, and around 1:30 a.m., I noticed something new. The door to room 309 was open. It wasn't supposed to be. I'd checked it earlier. I walked toward it slowly. When I looked inside, I saw a boy sitting on his bed facing the wall. He didn't react when I stepped into the room. "Hey," I said quietly, "why are you still up?" He didn't answer right away. I waited. Finally, he said something so quietly I almost didn't hear him. He started again. I felt my chest tighten. "Who?" The boy didn't turn around. "The one in the hall." I stepped closer. "What do you mean?" He stayed quiet for a few seconds before answering again. "He counts," he said. The way he said it made my stomach drop. "How do you know that?" He finally turned his head slightly, just enough that I could see part of his face. "Because sometimes," he said quietly, "he gets it wrong." I didn't know what to say to that. After a few seconds, I told him to lie down and try to sleep. He did immediately, without arguing. I stood there watching him for a moment before leaving the room and closing the door. I stayed in the hallway afterward, listening, but I didn't hear anything else for the next hour. Around 2:40 a.m., I heard the dragging sound again, this time from the stairwell. I moved toward it quickly. The sound stopped as soon as I reached the landing, but when I stepped into the hallway, I saw something that made my hands start shaking again. Every door along the corridor was slightly open, just like the first night I worked there. I walked slowly down the hallway, closing them one by one. Most of the kids were asleep, but when I reached room 309 again, the boy was sitting up, waiting, watching the door. "He's here," he whispered as soon as I stepped inside. I turned back towards the hallway automatically. The dragging sound started again, louder than before, closer, and for the first time since I'd started working there, I heard something else mixed into it. A voice, low, uneven, counting, so quietly I could barely make out the words, but clear enough that I understood what I was hearing. 24, 25. The boy grabbed my sleeve suddenly. "He always stops at 27, he whispered. I felt cold all over. "How do you know that?" I asked. He didn't answer. We both stood there listening. The voice outside continued slowly. 26. Then silence. No 27. The dragging sound stopped. The hallway went completely quiet again. The boy slowly let go of my sleeve. Neither one of us spoke for a long time after that. And as I stood there, listening to the silence settle back into the building, I realized something I hadn't thought about before. There were 27 kids living at West Ridge House. Exactly 27. For the rest of that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the number. 27. I checked the roster the second I got back to the staff office. There it was again. 27 names. Same as always. I stared at the list longer than I should have, running through them slowly in my head like I expected something to change if I looked at it long enough. Nothing did. But the next night, something small happened that made the number feel different. It was just after midnight when one of the evening staff mentioned casually that one of the younger boys had been moved earlier that day. "Transferred," she said. I didn't think much about it at first. Kids came and went there all the time. But later that night, when I checked the roster again, I noticed something strange. The total was still 27. A new name had replaced the old one. I told myself that was normal too, but something about it didn't sit right with me. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention to the transfers, and I realized something I hadn't noticed before. The number never changed. No matter how many kids left, no matter how many arrived, there were always exactly 27. That realization stayed in the back of my mind until the night everything changed. It started like every other shift. Nothing unusual during the first few hours. But at 1:58 a.m., the monitors flickered, just for a second. I leaned closer to the screen. All the hallway feeds were still there, but something about them looked different. The lighting seemed dimmer somehow, like the brightness had been turned down across every camera at once. I stared at them for several seconds before hearing the dragging sound again. Louder than I'd ever heard it before. I didn't hesitate this time. I left the office immediately and headed for the stairs. The sound continued the entire way up, slow, heavy, deliberate. When I reached the third-floor landing, I stopped. The hallway lights were flickering slightly now. Not enough to go out, just enough to make the shadows move along the walls. The dragging sound came again, from the far end of the corridor, near room 307. I started walking toward it slowly. Halfway down the hall, I noticed something else. Every door was open. Not slightly this time, fully open. I stopped walking.
The hallway felt colder than ever before. I could feel it in my hands and face now. The dragging sound stopped suddenly. The silence that followed felt wrong in a way I can't really explain, like something was waiting. I stood there for several seconds before taking another step forward. That's when I heard it again. The voice. Low, uneven, counting. 23. The sound came from directly ahead of me, but the hallway looked empty. 24. I kept walking slowly, my eyes moving between the open doorways and the floor. 25. My hands were shaking now. 26. I stopped walking. I waited for the next number, but it didn't come. The silence stretched on longer than before. Then, from somewhere very close to me, I heard something else. Footsteps. Soft. Barely there. Moving slowly behind me. I turned around immediately. The hallway behind me was still empty, but when I turned back toward the far end again, I saw something I hadn't seen before. Right in the center of the floor, near room 307, was a dark shape, low to the ground, still. I walked toward it slowly, my eyes fixed on the spot. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a shape. It was a shadow, but there was nothing there to cast it. I stopped several feet away from it. The air felt colder the closer I got. Then the shadow moved, just slightly, like something shifting its weight. I took one step back without thinking, and that's when I heard the voice again, right next to me. 27. I felt the breath at my ear when it said it. I didn't think after that. I turned and walked back down the hallway as fast as I could, without running. I didn't look behind me once. I stayed in the staff office for the rest of the night, with every light on and every monitor in view. Nothing else happened. But the next morning, when I checked the roster again, there were still 27 names. Except this time, one of them was missing from the list I remembered the night before. And in its place was a name I didn't recognize.
I didn't say anything about the name at first. I just stared at the roster longer than I should have, running my finger slowly down the list again and again, like I'd missed something the first time. I hadn't. One of the names I remembered clearly from the week before was gone. In its place was someone new. No transfer note, no intake paperwork in the tray beside the clipboard. Nothing. Just a different name. I told myself there had to be a simple explanation. There always was. But for the rest of that morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to notice. That night, I arrived early for my shift. I told myself I just wanted to check the paperwork again before things got busy. The evening supervisor gave me a quick rundown, like always. No incidents, no behavior issues, everything normal. But before she left, I asked her casually about the new kid. She looked at me for a second, like she wasn't sure what I meant. "Which one?" "The new one," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "The name on the roster this morning." She hesitated. Then she said something that didn't make sense. "We didn't get anyone new today." I didn't respond right away. She must have noticed the look on my face because she added quickly, "You probably just misread it." Then she grabbed her bag and left. I stood there for a few seconds after the door closed, replaying the conversation in my head. I knew I hadn't misread it. That night felt different from the start. The building was quieter than usual, even before lights out. The kids moved through their routines without speaking much, and several of them kept looking toward the stairwell like they were waiting for something. At 10:30 p.m., after the last room checks, I sat in the office and watched the monitors longer than usual before starting my rounds. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't relax. Around midnight, I heard something else for the first time. Not dragging, not whispering, just a soft knocking sound somewhere in the building. Slow, uneven. At first, I thought it was coming from upstairs again, but when I stepped into the hallway to listen, I realized it was coming from below me, the basement. I stood at the top of the stairs for a long time, listening, before I finally started down. The lights flickered slightly as I reached the bottom. The basement was mostly storage rooms and maintenance space. I didn't go down there often at night unless I had a reason to. That night, I wasn't sure why I kept walking. The knocking sound got louder the farther down the hallway I went. Slow, uneven, like someone tapping carefully against wood. I followed it to the far end of the corridor. There was only one door there, a heavy gray metal door I'd never had a reason to open before. I stood in front of it listening. The knocking stopped the second I reached it. The silence afterward felt worse than the sound. I stood there for a few seconds before reaching for the handle. It didn't move. Locked. I leaned closer to the door without thinking. That's when I heard it again. Soft breathing, just on the other side. I stepped back immediately. For a few seconds, I just stood there, staring at the door, trying to decide if I should get someone else. But I already knew what they'd say. They'd say it was nothing, just like everything else. I went back upstairs slowly. When I reached the main floor again, I checked the monitors immediately. All the hallways were still empty, but one screen caught my attention right away. The third floor hallway. The lights were flickering again, and every door was open. I didn't hesitate this time. I headed for the stairs immediately. Halfway up, I heard the dragging sound again, louder than I'd ever heard it before. It continued as I climbed. When I reached the landing, I stopped. The hallway stretched ahead of me completely empty, but the sound didn't stop. It was coming from the far end again, near room 307. I walked toward it slowly. My hands were shaking again. The dragging sound stopped suddenly when I was halfway down the corridor. The silence afterward lasted longer than usual. Then I heard the voice again, very close, counting. 25. I stopped walking. 26. I waited for the next number, but instead of 27, the voice said something else. Again. I felt cold all over. The hallway stayed silent after that. For a few seconds, I couldn't move at all. Then I noticed something else. Every door along the hallway was closing, slowly, one after another, without any sound. I watched them shut one after another until only one was left open. Room 307. I stood there staring at it for a long time before finally forcing myself to move forward again. When I reached the doorway, I stopped. The room was dark, but I could hear breathing again, more than one person this time. I didn't step inside. I just stood there listening. And while I stood there, I heard something shift quietly in the hallway behind me. I didn't turn around right away. For a few seconds, I just stood in the doorway of room 307, listening to the breathing inside and the silence behind me, trying to figure out which one I was more afraid of. The sound in the room was clearer now. Not one person, several. Slow, uneven breathing layered together in a way that made it impossible to count how many there were. I should have left. Instead, I stayed there too long. Then I heard the movement behind me again, closer this time, a soft step across the floor. I turned around slowly. The hallway was empty. Every door was closed now except room 307, but the air felt colder than anything I'd experienced there before. I stepped back from the doorway instinctively. That's when I saw it again, the gray smear across the floor, fresh, starting just behind me and stretching down the corridor toward the stairwell. I stared at it for a few seconds before something else caught my attention, a shape near the far end of the hallway, standing against the wall. I couldn't tell at first what I was looking at, but then it moved slightly, and I realized it was a person, a child, standing completely still in the shadows near the emergency exit door. I started walking toward them slowly. As I got closer, I saw who it was, the boy from room 309. He didn't react when I approached him. He was facing the wall again like the girls had been that night. "What are you doing out here?" I asked quietly. He didn't answer right away. I waited. Finally, he spoke without turning around. "He's upset." I felt a knot form in my stomach. "Who?" "The one who counts," he said. I stood there for a second, trying to figure out what to say. "Why?" The boy stayed silent for a moment before answering. "Because someone is missing." I felt cold all over again. "What do you mean?" He turned his head slowly toward me. His eyes looked different than they had before. Tired, but focused in a way that made me uneasy. "He can't finish anymore," he said quietly. I didn't understand what he meant at first, but then I thought about what I'd heard earlier. Again. The word kept replaying in my head. I told him gently to go back to his room. He didn't argue. He just walked past me slowly, without looking back. I stood there alone in the hallway after he left, listening to the silence again. Then I heard something else, a door opening somewhere behind me. I turned around quickly. Room 307 was still open, but another door farther down the hallway was moving slowly inward. Room 312. I walked toward it carefully. When I looked inside, I saw something I wasn't expecting. Every bed in the room was empty. I stepped inside slowly. The blankets were pulled back neatly, like the kids had gotten up at the same time. I checked the bathroom. Empty. Closets. Empty. I walked back into the hallway quickly after that. The corridor was still silent, but when I reached the staff office a few minutes later and checked the monitors again, every hallway camera was empty. Every room looked normal, nothing out of place. For the rest of the night, I stayed in the office, watching the screens and trying to make sense of what I'd seen. At 5:30 a.m., the day staff started arriving. I reported everything again, this time to both Daniel Harlow and the morning supervisor. They listened carefully while I explained what happened. When I finished, there was a long silence in the room. Then Daniel said something I hadn't heard him say before. "You should take a few days off." I stared at him. "I'm fine," I said automatically. But he shook his head. "You're overtired," he said calmly. "Night shifts affect people differently." I knew what he meant. He thought I was imagining things, or at least that's what he wanted me to believe. But as I left his office that morning, I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. On the bulletin board near the staff entrance was a printed list of residents. I stopped and looked at it. There were still 27 names, but this time I recognized every single one of them, except one, and that name was mine.
I stood there staring at the list longer than I should have. My name was printed clearly between two others, in the same font, the same size, the same spacing, like it had always been there. For a few seconds, I honestly thought I was about to pass out. I checked it again, then again. Still there. I didn't remember moving, but the next thing I knew, I was back in the staff office, sitting down with my hands on the desk, trying to slow my breathing. I told myself there had to be a mistake, a paperwork error. Someone had typed the wrong name. But the longer I sat there, the less convincing that explanation felt, because deep down, I already knew something else. I knew I hadn't seen my name on that list before, not once. That night, I came back early again. I told myself I just wanted to double-check the paperwork before my shift started, but really, I wanted to know if the name would still be there. It was, exactly where I'd seen it that morning. I didn't say anything to anyone. Instead, I signed in quietly and went about my shift like normal, but everything felt different now. Every hallway, every door, every camera feed, it all felt closer somehow. Around midnight, I started noticing something else I hadn't picked up on before. The building didn't just feel quiet, it felt aware, like something was paying attention to me specifically. I couldn't explain that feeling logically, but I couldn't ignore it either. At 1:40 a.m., I heard the dragging sound again. Not loud this time, just enough to make me stand up immediately. I didn't wait. I went straight to the stairs. The sound stopped halfway up like it always did. But when I reached the third floor, the hallway looked different than I'd ever seen it before. All the lights were on. Every door was closed. Everything looked completely normal. For a moment, I actually felt relieved. Then I heard the voice again, behind me. 1. I froze. The sound was clearer than I'd ever heard it before. Slow, deliberate, counting upward this time. 2. I turned slowly. No one was there. 3. I stayed still, listening. The numbers continued quietly behind me while I stood there trying to understand what was happening. 4. 5. I didn't move until I heard something else. Doors opening somewhere down the hallway. I turned back toward the corridor. Room 307 was open again. I walked toward it slowly. The counting behind me didn't stop. It just continued quietly while I moved forward. 9. 10. When I reached the doorway, I stopped. The room looked empty again, but the air felt colder than anywhere else in the building. I stepped inside slowly. The numbers on the wall were still there, but now there were more of them. Fresh scratches across the paint I knew hadn't been there before. 14. The counting had moved closer. I could feel it behind me now. 15. I didn't turn around. I just stood there staring at the wall, trying to slow my breathing. 16. Then I heard something else. Footsteps in the hallway, more than one pair, moving slowly toward the room. I finally turned around. The doorway was filled with shadows. At first, I couldn't see clearly. Then I realized what I was looking at. Kids, standing shoulder to shoulder in the hall, perfectly still, watching me. I recognized some of them immediately. Others I didn't, but all of them were silent. 20. The counting stopped suddenly. No one moved. I stood there looking at them for several seconds before I finally spoke. "What are you doing out here?" No one answered. They just kept staring at me. I felt my chest tighten again. Then one of them stepped forward slowly, the boy from room 309. He looked up at me without blinking. "He finished," he said quietly.
I didn't understand what he meant. Who? The one who counts, he said. I felt cold all over again. What does that mean? The boy hesitated for a second before answering. It means, he said slowly, he knows which one is next. I didn't say anything else after that. None of us did. We just stood there in silence for what felt like a very long time. Then, one by one, the kids turned and walked away down the hallway without another word. I stayed in room 307 for several minutes after they left, long enough for the building to feel quiet again. But as I stood there alone, staring at the scratched numbers on the wall, I realized something I hadn't understood before. The counting had started over, and this time, it had reached me.
I didn't finish my rounds that night. After the kids left the hallway, I stayed inside room 307 longer than I should have, staring at the numbers carved into the wall and trying to convince myself I wasn't understanding what was happening. But deep down, I already did. The counting wasn't random. It wasn't just sound. It meant something. And for the first time since I started working there, I knew I wasn't just hearing it. I was part of it. I left the room eventually and went straight back to the staff office. I didn't check the rest of the building. I didn't look at the monitors. I just sat there until morning with the lights on and the door closed, listening to every small sound the building made and waiting for the shift to end. The next morning, I didn't go home right away. Instead, I went straight to Daniel Harlow's office. He was already there, like he'd been expecting me. He looked up from his desk as soon as I walked in. "You didn't finish your rounds," he said calmly. It wasn't a question. I didn't bother pretending. "I need to know what's happening here," I said. He watched me quietly for a few seconds before gesturing for me to sit down. I didn't. "I saw my name on the roster," I said. He didn't react right away. Then he nodded slowly, like he'd been waiting for me to say it. "Yes," he said quietly. That was the moment I realized he already knew everything. I stared at him for a long time before speaking again. "What is this place?" He folded his hands on the desk in front of him before answering. "It's exactly what it looks like," he said. "That's not true," I said immediately. He didn't argue. Instead, he leaned back slightly and studied me for a moment. Then he said something I'll never forget. "You've been here long enough to notice the pattern." I didn't answer. He continued. "There are always 27, he said. I felt cold again. "Why?" He hesitated for a few seconds before answering. "Because that's how many he needs." I didn't understand what he meant. "Who?" But he didn't answer right away. Instead, he asked me something else. "When did you first hear him?" I thought about it for a second. "My first week," I said. He nodded slowly. "That's how it starts," he said quietly. I felt my hands tighten at my sides. "What starts?" He took a long breath before answering. "The counting." The room felt very quiet for several seconds after that. Then I asked the question I'd been avoiding since I walked in. "Who is he?" Daniel didn't look away when he answered. "No one knows exactly," he said, "but we know what he does." I waited. "He counts," Daniel said. The simplicity of the answer made it worse somehow. "For what?" Daniel hesitated again. Then he said quietly, "For the ones who stay." I stared at him. "And the ones who don't?" He said, "They leave." The way he said it made something in my chest tighten again. I didn't speak for several seconds. Then I asked the question I'd been afraid to ask since I saw the roster. Why is my name on the list? Daniel didn't answer right away. When he finally did, his voice was quieter than before. Because he heard you. I didn't understand. He hears the ones who listen, he said. I stood there trying to process what he was saying. That doesn't make sense, I said finally. He didn't argue with me. Instead, he said something else. Before you came here, we lost one. I felt my stomach drop. Lost? He nodded once. He stopped counting, Daniel said quietly. I felt cold all over again. And now? Daniel looked at me for a long time before answering. Now he started again. The room stayed silent after that. I didn't know what to say. After a few seconds, Daniel spoke again. You should leave, he said. I stared at him. What? You should go home, he said calmly. Take a few days. Don't come back. I didn't understand. Why? He didn't answer right away. When he finally did, his voice was quieter than before, because he finished counting last night. I didn't say anything after that. I just stood there staring at him. Then I turned and walked out of his office without another word. I didn't go back for another shift after that. I didn't even pack my locker. I just left. For weeks afterwards, I tried to forget about the place completely. I didn't talk about it. I didn't think about it. But sometimes, late at night, when everything was quiet, I'd still hear it. Faint, slow, uneven, counting. And every time I heard it, it always stopped at the same number. 27.
I didn't go back to West Ridge House after that. Not once. For a while, I told myself that leaving had solved everything. I slept better the first few nights away from the job than I had in weeks. No long hallways, no monitors humming in the dark, no footsteps that didn't belong to anyone. But the quiet didn't last. About 10 days after I quit, I woke up in the middle of the night for no reason I could explain. My room was completely still. No traffic outside, no voices in the house, nothing. I lay there staring at the ceiling for a few minutes before I realized what had woken me. A sound. Faint. So quiet I almost missed it. A soft, dragging noise somewhere in the room. I sat up immediately and listened. It stopped right away. The silence afterward felt familiar in a way I didn't like. I stayed awake for a long time that night with the light on. Nothing else happened. The next few days were normal. I tried to move on with my life. I applied for other jobs, met friends, did everything I could to put distance between myself and what I'd experienced. But the sounds came back. Not every night, just often enough that I couldn't ignore them anymore. Sometimes it was the dragging noise, sometimes faint tapping against the wall. Once, I woke up at exactly 2:47 a.m. to the sound of slow breathing beside my bed. When I turned on the light, the room was empty. After a few weeks, I stopped sleeping well altogether. I kept telling myself it was stress, that I'd brought the fear home with me, that it would pass. But one night, about a month later, something happened that made me realize I was wrong. I was lying in bed reading when I heard it again. The counting. Very quiet at first. So quiet I almost thought it was outside. I turned off the light and listened. The numbers were clearer in the dark. 19. I didn't move. 20. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the room. 21. I sat up slowly, my eyes adjusting to the dark. 22. The sound came from somewhere near the foot of the bed. I didn't breathe. 23. I turned on the light suddenly. The room was empty. The counting stopped immediately. I stayed awake until morning after that. I never heard it again for a while. Months passed. Eventually, life started feeling normal again. I found another job, moved into a different apartment, stopped thinking about West Ridge House altogether. Until last winter. I was working late one night and didn't get home until after midnight. The apartment building was quiet when I came in. I remember thinking how peaceful it felt compared to where I'd lived before. I locked the door behind me and went straight to bed. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up again, for no clear reason. The room was completely dark. I lay there for a few seconds listening. At first, I didn't hear anything. Then I noticed something else. My bedroom door was open. I always closed it before I went to sleep. I sat up slowly and looked toward the hallway. For a moment, everything was silent. Then I heard it again. The dragging sound. Soft, slow, coming from the hall. I didn't move. The sound got closer, stopping just outside the doorway. The silence that followed lasted a long time. Then I heard something I hadn't heard in months. The voice. Low, uneven, counting. 24. I felt cold all over again. 25. I stayed completely still. 26. I waited for the next number, but instead of saying 27, the voice stopped. And after a few seconds of silence, I heard something else, a quiet whisper, right outside the door, not counting this time, just one word, again. I didn't sleep the rest of that night, and I still don't sleep well now, because sometimes, when everything is quiet enough, I still hear it, faint, slow, uneven, counting somewhere just out of sight, and I don't know if it ever really stopped, or if it's just waiting to start over again.
If this story stayed with you, make sure you subscribe. Most people listen quietly and leave, but if you're still here, you're probably one of the few who actually felt it. Like the video if you enjoyed it, and share it with someone who shouldn't be listening to this alone.